Hi, Misha here, and I was brainstorming what to do a video on. We looked at all the AKs recently, we looked at ARs and FALs, and while I've been able to put up 4 or 5 range videos, that was all Jero and I had time to shoot last time we were out. There will be another trip coming very soon, but the truth of the matter is, I got a little sick. Part of it's just the silly weather, hot, cold. But I think I did pick up a bug on my travels, and then I passed that along to my wife. I'm on the mend now, but it's still not 100%, and she's kind of at the low point. So it's been hard to make videos, voice and whatnot, not holding out. And I've also been very busy at work for various reasons. So just haven't had a lot of video time, but we'll rectify that with the next range trip. But I thought the topic of this video might be fun and interesting. And if you agree, let me know. I thought let's kind of look at and do an overview of the small arms, the general issue guns of the U.S. Army, Marines, and others in World War II. Thought this might be kind of fun. I have the majority, but not everything. I will say, for YouTube's sake, any submachine guns in the video are semi-automatic only. Everything else is original as I can make it. But I do want to also give a special thanks before we dive in. The day I'm recording this video, something very bad happened. Google has been saying for a couple of months now that HTML mail is going away and that standard mail will be the only thing you could use. I've been dreading this because I use a screen reader. As most of you know, I'm blind. And the problem is, when I looked up online how to use standard mail with screen readers, while it says things have gotten a lot better, some things are still, quote, problematic. Basically, I wasn't able to use my email for a day till I kind of worked out a new way to get in and new way to get around. It's still not as quick and convenient as the old way. I've been telling people what used to be 2 or 3, keystrokes to get from email to email is now about 10 or 12 for me. And when you have to go through a few dozen emails at a time, that really adds up. I'm sure I'll get more proficient, and I'm sure there'll be patches and updates to my TTS to make it better. But for now, considering I run my business primarily through email, it was stressful. But some good news. When I was finally able to check my email, one of the messages was a new Patreon supporter, $5 a month, Zeke, Z-I-Q-K-E. And I wanted to do a special call out and thank you, because that was just a tad bit of good news, tad bit of being positive and support at a time that I really could use it. So thank you. It came in at the right time and kind of just saved, the dehumidifier, saved my mood. So greatly appreciated to Zeke and, of course, everyone else who donates on Patreon. Check it out if interested. It helps fund those range trips. But with that out of the way, no further ado, let's talk about America's guns in World War II. Even though the M1 Garand, of course, is the iconic Second World War American rifle, rightfully so, early on, the venerable Model 1903 more than carried its weight, especially with the Marines, and most especially in the Pacific. After all, an argument can be made that in that environment, perhaps a bolt action could be superior to a self-loader, especially a new at the time self-loader. And when the 1903 was introduced, actually beginning in 1905, it was a pretty forward-thinking bolt-action rifle in the short rifle concept with a 24-inch barrel, 44-inch overall length, and under 9 pounds, give or take. Of course, it served through World War I. Last year I did a video on the Pedersen device. Check that out if interested. But we're going to talk about World War II production and service. So I have 2 examples here. On the top we have an original World War I gun that was refurbished during World War II, presumably for the Marines. And on the bottom, we actually have a World War II production 1903, not A3. During the interwar period, the 1903 was produced in limited numbers by Springfield. Rock Island had closed shortly after the Great War. Not much really changed, although in 1928, the 1903 A1 was introduced that had a semi-pistol grip stock, a C-type. And in the 30s, the Hatcher hull was added. You can see that here. There's not a hole on this side, but if you look at this one, you'll notice there is, right there at the wood line. That was just to be a secondary gas escape. There is a small one on the right over there. And some guns will have both, although wartime production just have the one on the left, which was better for ruptured cartridges. Those are really the two notable changes. The 1903 A2 was a subcaliber device for artillery, not really pertinent. And actually, the story here for the Remington production began before the war, because initially the idea was that Remington would make these in 303 for the British, but this never came to fruition. Instead, around September of 1941, Remington was tooling up to make 1903s, using a lot of the old Rock Island tooling. And they would make them with straight stocks, mostly because that's just the blanks they received. These were typically walnut. They wanted to do the A1 standard, but they just didn't have the stocks. So, yeah, they made these. And originally the government would order, rolling over here, 130,000 or so. The first ones from Remington would be delivered in November, so right before the war, and then right after Pearl Harbor, the order would be increased to over 300,000, and then eventually over 500,000 from Remington. And at this point, with this high of a demand, Remington realized that their tooling from Rock Island was really worn out. They would need to do something about that, acquire new tooling techniques, really kind of lean into the scaled-up production. Because there just were not enough M1 Grands to go around. The military had already been expanding before the war, somewhat after the 20s and 30s. So that's why Remington had the contract. But with the two wars, two fronts, they just did not have enough Grands, and they knew they would not for a few years. So that's why older rifles like this were given new barrels and otherwise reworked and refurbished and put into service, and then new production O3s. These would all have phosphate finish, at least for the barrel and the receiver, although you will find some blued small parts here and there. That's just for the O3. And actually a second manufacturer would be sought out, known as Smith Corona, and that kind of pivots us into this rifle's successor, the 1903 A3. This was developed at Remington early on in 1942. Part of it was to use new tooling, part of it was to speed up production and reduce costs, and part of it was to make the rifle a little easier to use and more in line with the M1 Garand. For example, the scant stock here was essentially taking a standard blank and trying to give it a semi-pistol grip. Not a full A1 style, but better than that, and that kind of mirrored the M1 Garand. And ditto goes for the rear sight being mounted on the receiver bridge back here. An aperture is just more useful in actual combat versus the very nice but somewhat unrealistic adjustable ladder sight on the O3. It also gives you a little bit better sight radius. Overall, a simpler sight to manufacture, and frankly more useful for the guys in the field. So the 1903 A3 was accepted by the U.S. government in May of 1942, and Remington would start manufacturing these later that summer, switching over. There would be a transitional model known as the 1903 Modified or 1903M that essentially retained the sight arrangement of the 03, but had several of the expedited features of the 03A3. So let's talk about those for a minute. For one, machining was reduced when and where possible. If you look at the one on the top here, you see these nice scallops on the barrel. Those go away, even with 03 production during World War II. And the A3 would continue that, although it's under the handguard, so you don't see it. So to simplify that, of course, the big deal was the use of stamped parts. A stamped trigger guard and more or less fixed floor plate versus here that has the standard machined style. And the barrel bands, these are machined, and they went to stampings. And of course the swivels. For whatever reason, the rear swivel seems to have remained machined, at least on most I've seen, but the front swivel and stacking hook went to this stamped style. Still had a bayonet lug, all that good stuff, so we're not like Japanese late war or Krieg's model. Still had a full-length handguard, in fact a little bit more, but it is simplified versus the kind of notch style on the A3. Just little things to expedite machining, but also in some ways make a better gun. Of course, it still has a 5-round internal box mag and firing 30-06. These would mostly be used with the standard M2 ball, introduced around 1938. So yeah, by the end of 1942, Remington started delivering 03 A3s, but they were still shipping some 03 modifieds out. In fact, the last 03 types would not leave Remington until April of 1943. So there was a little bit of an overlap there for a few months where either one could be shipped out, and both were approved, so sure, why not? But like I said, there's another manufacturer too, and they pretty much just made the 03A3. Smith Corona initially agreed to build these for the U.S. government in February of 1942. They even approached High Standard as well, but as it turned out, High Standard was rather busy, so they ended up being a subcontractor for Smith Corona, a typewriter maker, mostly doing barrels for them. And Smith Corona was picked because they were actually really near Remington in New York, so that they could cooperate and share expertise. Either way, Smith Corona started working on their pilot batch, and their original order, which was original 03s, was changed to 03 A3s when it was introduced. And they would make their first test runs in late summer, early fall of 1942. And actually, Smith Corona 1903 A3s would be delivered to the U.S. government, the U.S. military, slightly before Remington in November of 1942. But pretty much all that they made were this configuration. And the original contract was for roughly $300,000. And again, Remington's original contract was for $500,000, although it would be increased, as you'll see. And that's what was turning out in 42, 43, bolt-action, traditional short rifles. And while many did make it to Europe, these were mostly used in the Pacific or kept stateside for various guard training, reserve use. Of course, I have to mention, even though I don't have one to show you, the 1903 A4, the sniper rifle, as it was styled. In fact, it was the first true general issue sniper rifle in U.S. service. It had a Weaver 2.2 magnified optic. It was essentially an 03 A3, but no sights, different style of stock, of course, and changes made for the optic. It was okay for a mass-produced marksman rifle, but it had some issues. Nevertheless, it would soldier on for quite a while. Throughout the war, especially 1944-45, most units would trade in their 03s, 03 A3s, and get M1 Grands or M1 Carbines or something else. So by 1945, while this was still in service, it wasn't as much so. The 03A4 definitely hung on. Grenadiers, some artillerymen still kept these, second line self-defense guns. But for the most part, that was the high water mark. Remington would build just shy of 350,000 03s or 03 modifieds before switching over to the 03A3, like this one here, and they would build over 700,000 of these. So about a 2-to-1 ratio, meaning that in total they built over 1 million bolt actions during the war. And Smith Corona would build about 235,000 03A3s. So that means we're well over 1.25 million built during the war. And because things are going better, the contracts started to be closed down. Basically, a stop order was issued in February, March of 1944. So they would pretty much finish up what they were doing, deliver their final batches, and then shut down the production lines. Really around the time of D-Day, give or take. Again, I'm just hanging out. It's a very casual video. Don't want to get too bogged down in the numbers, but I just want to point out the time the war ended a year later, the production of 03A3s was over. But of course, its service would continue on for a while. So a bolt action in the war actually wasn't a bad idea, frankly. These were good guns, accurate, a few different barrel styles. You hear about 2-groove and 5-groove rifling. Different things were used. But by the end of World War II, the day of the bolt action was over. So next, let's talk about another kind of traditional classic gun they would soldier on from before, during, and after the war. This is one of my favorite guns that I have, partially because it's an American classic and almost unique and exclusive to the American military, but also because it came from a good friend of mine years ago, John. The Riot shotgun with bayonet attachment, aka the trench shotgun, or just trench gun. Like I said, a true American classic. Started off in World War I and almost was unchanged through World War II and even Korea. And while many were used, over half a dozen, the big maker was Winchester. And there were 2 models that they had. The model 1897, M97, and the model 1912, M12, which is this here. The design started off from John Moses Browning, as most American designs from the late 19th century did, and the 97 version, which had an exposed hammer, was really Winchester's first smokeless powder-capable 12-gauge. This would be when the new 2 3/4 shells were coming around, slowly but surely replacing the original 2.5-inch shells. And the first time America really employed shotguns was in the Philippines during police actions. And that's actually why the 97 was preferred in World War I versus the 12. Now, the Model 12 here was out. It was introduced in, well, would you believe it, the 1912, although that was a 20-gauge version. 1914, Winchester introduced the 12-gauge here and a 16-gauge. And Winchester actually said this was the perfect shotgun. Pump action, 5-shot capacity, it handled the newest shells, and the internal hammer is definitely an improvement over the 97. The only benefit the 97 might have had was you could recock it, but the shape of the stock, the semi-pistol grip, yeah, it was a better gun. But the reason the U.S. preferred the 97 in World War I was because General Pershing and many others were just familiar with it. It had been used in the Philippines, it was a known quantity, so that's what they ordered. But they did order 600 Model 12s, M12s in World War I. Now, these weren't trench guns with the heat shield. They were just riot style. And you would even see some long barrels, too. Now, this heat shield, This was actually designed by Springfield, not Winchester. But they had a problem. They really couldn't get a Model 1903 bayonet to work properly on a shotgun. So what Winchester proposed was this. The M1917 bayonet, which they were installing on the new M1917 US Enfield, essentially a copy, of course, of the P13 British bayonet, because they'd been making the P14 at Winchester, and Remington for that matter, for the war. And this would work, and this is what Springfield went with. And a bayonet on a trench gun was actually very important because of the relatively limited capacity, 5, 4, 6 shots, depending on the exact model. The trench gun was really adopted for patrol duties, of course, use in the tight trenches, and other close range, kind of CQBs we call it today. But its relatively short range was noted. Also, the ammunition was heavy if you used brass cased ammo, and if you used the paper patch type shells, well, those are susceptible to moisture. It really wouldn't be until the plastic shell would come around that it would be the best of both worlds. But this way you had something up close and personal. Luckily, the 1917 bayonet is pretty long. Sorry this one's covered in Cosmoline, but yeah. By the way, easy way to tell these from an Enfield, these two vertical grooves on the grip. Easy identification of a British or American Enfield bayonet for the 1917 P14 versus other things. But it was important because that was the rolls for this gun. So that was World War I. During the interwar period, a few more riot guns and trench guns were bought. Essentially, a riot gun would have no assembly and an 18-inch barrel. Trench gun would have a 20-inch barrel. And the military also had some long barrels for training and skeet shooting, competition and fun. But the trench version was really the one meant for frontline service, as it were. Riot guns were more guard duty, but they were used interchangeably. When World War II kicked off, the U.S. had roughly 21,000 combat shotguns in inventory, most Winchesters, but a few other types. But that meant, well, they would definitely need more for the war, and again, they would turn to Winchester because, well, kind of the name in shotguns, at least it was back then. Moving this long-o thing around, I hear Crocodile Dundee. That's not a knife. This is a knife. Anyway, welcome to my brain. So they would sign a contract with Winchester, March of 1942, and this time they would pick up a pretty even mix of Model 12s and Model 97s, trench guns, riot guns, long barrels. The only real difference, the heat shield would go from 6 small holes to 4 larger holes, a little quicker to make, also a little more durable, a little sturdier, less spacing. The early guns would have a high gloss blued finish, but very quickly Winchester would switch over to a military grade kind of matte blue with less polishing. Now the M97 would pretty much remain blued throughout the war, although of course refurbishments could be phosphate, but the Model 12 here would actually go over to phosphating around 1944. And they would have routine deliveries throughout the years, with the final ones getting shipped over around March of 1944, about the same time that the 03A3s were getting wrapped up. And by that point, they had quite a few. They would have around 39,000 M97s, but they would have over 61,000 M12s, again, riot and trench combined, with a small number of long barrels. So while they were both bought, roughly 100,000 in total, the majority, 2/3 or slightly less, were this M12 here. And just your traditional slide action gun, with the major difference in the two designs being here. This work was actually done by Thomas Crossley Johnson, based on Browning's original work. Used a standard sling on swivels, hard rubber butt plate, hardwood furniture, and what have you. Most shotguns were used, at least in combat, in the Pacific. not as many made it over to Europe. Part of it was just the supply chains. Part of it was just these were better at the island type combat, close range, caves, jungle warfare. Not as useful in the kind of warfare over in Europe and North Africa. Longer ranges and what have you. And like I said, many were kept stateside, especially the riot guns and some of the semi-autos for training, especially aerial gunnering with the semi-autos, and then guard duty on factories, facilities, security, as it were. And they were well liked for what it was. Now, while the guns themselves aren't that big and heavy, the ammunition is. If you have a bag, the standard ammo bag, and I have one, I just couldn't find it during this video, holds 32 cartridges, 32 shells. You load that up, especially if you're using brass case, it's a chunk. So that was one of the downsides. Of course, you could top them off on the fly. Single arm to the pump, corncob style, simple bead sight. Nothing really fancy here, but it got the job done, and they were rather prized by the soldiers that got their hands on them. But it really is just a uniquely American thing. As is famously known in World War I, the Germans protested in the summer of 1918. However, in World War II, Germans and Japanese didn't have a lot to say. At that point, the idea of civility, of war, a gentleman's agreement, that kind of thing, was mostly over with. But many of these would survive on, both in M97 and M12, through Korea, and even some into Vietnam, especially the M12. Winchester would actually discontinue the 97 production line just for the civilian market in 1956, and then the M12 line would be discontinued beginning in 1963 and kind of ending in 1966. Very popular for the company, and just something I had to talk about. It was a specialized tool, but really was good for guard duties, patrol. You hear them also used for like prisoner guarding. And it was a big piece of steel and wood to put a pig sticker on as well. But with that, kind of looking at some very traditional guns, let's scale things back and scale them down and talk about personal sidearms. Keeping on with the JMB theme, of course, we have to talk about the model 1911, or rather the 1911A1. Of course, the 1911 is very famous from World War I, the Great War, primarily manufactured by Colt, but also nearly 70, 80,000 were made by Springfield. You also had Remington UMC, and in 1918 they were actually giving contracts out to H&R and Savage, but the war came to a conclusion before that could go, and those contracts were stopped. So those were the makers, with Colt being the big one. That was the original, of course, 1911 style here. The A1 would come about between 1924 and 1926. There was a bit of a transitional period. And because the 1911 had so much testing done before it was fully adopted, when you went to the A1, it was mostly little cosmetic tweaks. Adjusting the sights, adjusting, of course, the backstrap, going from straight to curved, changing the size of the hammer, going from the kind of the large spur type to the somewhat slimmer type, and then also enlarging the rear sight notch a bit, and altering the size of the beaver tail for the grip safety, making it a little bit larger, recessing the trigger, scalloping the frame. Just little things like that to improve the ergonomics and handling and shooting. And of course, it still fired the classic 45 ACP round. That was really the round that won the U.S. military, mainly in the Army and Marines, over, because before that they'd really tried this out in 38 ACP and a few others, and it was the 45, kind of again harkening back to the Philippines and what have you. But 1920s, 1930s, especially with the Depression, the U.S. Army was cut back to just 144,000 full-time soldiers. and the other branches were similarly scaled back and had very limited budgets. So much so that in 1941, right before World War II, they were only showing about 140,000 pistols in inventory. That's not enough for wartime. Luckily, going back to 1940, the Army mainly had found a little bit of a workaround. This is my World War II Ithaca, and this is a direct result of this educational program or contract. Even though the budget Congress wouldn't allow acquisition of new handguns, they were allowed some trials guns for manufacturing to be set up just as a just-in-case type thing, experimental. Now, it actually didn't begin with Ithaca here. No, it actually started with Harrington and Richardson, H&R. They were given a pilot contract to build 1911 A1s, but they tried delivering their first 20 pistols at the end of 1941, and all were rejected. H&R was going through a lot of hard times, and the quality was falling off. Therefore, January of 1942, knowing they needed new makers, and since Ithaca was an established gun manufacturer up in New York next to Remington and others, they were invited to compete, and they would be soon awarded a contract to build 60,000, and of course this would be later increased, and that tooling that had been originally been sent to H&R would be transferred to Ithaca, and they would actually deliver their first few pistols at the end of 1942. And in the beginning, as they were setting up, they would get some parts and accessories and things from other places, including around 6,000 old Colt 1911 frames that Springfield had in storage. So some of the earliest ones would have those. Colt would also supply new frames and slides to Ithaca, virgin parts in the beginning. But by 1943, they were fully up and running, and they really had their act together by late summer of that year. Now, originally the military wanted 13,000 pistols a month. That seemed a little much, so they backed off to 10,000. But Ithaca didn't just make these, they did innovate. For example, they would introduce a new stamped trigger, the Yeoman trigger. This would save time and money. They would also go to a simple serrated backstrap, mainspring housing, and a simple serrated hammer, just to expedite things and still keep quality there. Otherwise, just a standard 1911 A1, single action only, of course, 7-round magazine, you know the deal. Classic American gun. And Ithaca would build 335,000 of these, give or take, during World War II. Of course, Colt would keep manufacturing of the 1911 A1 up. Now, this is a standard 1911 Colt, but they would make A1s during the war, building nearly 630,000. Colts could be blued or phosphated. For whatever reason, most I find are blued. And obviously they would go away from the wood grips to the Bakelite style. So Colt was definitely there. You also had Union Switch and Signal. They would build 55,000. So not tiny, but not a huge number. Of course, the most desirable 1911s today are from Singer Sewing Machine. They only did 500. Kind of makes you wonder why. Why only 500? Seems not really worth the time to set up just for that. Well, the answer actually lies here with the whole Remington-Rand story. With war kicking off in Europe in April of 1940, Singer would be awarded one of those educational contracts to build 500 test or proof of concept 1911 A1 pistols. So what happened? Well, unlike with H&R, they actually delivered all 500, really turning the last ones over right around the time of Pearl Harbor, December of 1941. And again, unlike H&R, the government was satisfied with them. They offered them a full contract. But the board of directors at Singer looked at what they were good at, what they could do, their abilities and shortcomings, and decided instead of making pistols, they were better suited to making parts for ships and similar naval equipment. So they politely declined the contract, and instead the tooling was transferred to Remington-Rand, who in March of 1942 was awarded a contract for over 120,000 1911 A1 pistols. And they actually set up an all-new factory in a formerly abandoned building. Talk about urban renewal. And started turning these out. And much like with Ithaca, early on they used parts from Colt, Springfields, even some leftover components from World War I. And they delivered their first couple hundred pistols to the Ordnance Department in November of 1942. Then they were accepted. And they were pretty much off to the races. They had a small glitch at Remington-Rand in the spring of 1943. They had to actually shut down production for a minute to kind of recalibrate tooling and whatnot because some of the specs were off and they weren't getting the full GI treatment they needed. But very soon, before the summer even, they were back up and running and building pistols. And they would even adopt a lot of the shortcuts and improvements introduced by Ithaca throughout the war. And they would end up building the most at over 875,000. So that's why Singers are so rare. It was just a test run, essentially. They were good, but ultimately we got Remington-Rand instead. The most produced. So 5 makers during the war. These are the 3 main ones. And in total, they built over 1,800,000, closer to 900,000. Plus, they had the original World War I era guns, so roughly 2 million in service. And very little variation, quite frankly. Very standardized. These would see service and use by all 5 branches, not to mention private security. Things like the Merchant Marines would have some. And they'd see frontline combat. They'd be used as a backup gun. Yeah, they were all over. Some of the complaints were they were a little big and heavy. And for new recruits, getting proficient shooting one of these accurately could be a challenge. It seems like once they got the hang of it, they were quite accurate, but it was a different kind of gun. Keep in mind that in the 1930s and 40s, if any civilians had a handgun, which was not all that common, chances are it was not an automatic. It was definitely still a revolver. I mean, this trend would continue in America throughout the 50s and 60s even. So it's no wonder that it took a little bit of a learning curve. And of course, these were a little expensive to produce for the standards at the time. But they were definitely iconic in the Pacific, North Africa, Europe, and they would have enough, even though 1911 A1 manufacturing would end in 1945, they would refurbish and repair these, the frames, all the way through Korea, Vietnam, and into the 1980s, some of them serving even longer than that with the Marines and other special units. But definitely a piece of Americana. But was not the only U.S. service sidearm. Far from it. Well, if there's a sidearm more iconic than the 1911 in America, it's just the good old revolver. It's American, thanks to the West and all that. Now this video is of course on World War II, but I couldn't at least touch upon the Model 1917 from World War I. Both Colt and Smith & Wesson would build these, roughly 300,000 in total, with the last ones coming from Smith & Wesson in 1919. These, of course, were based on the companies at the time, large frame, like, for example, the in-frame Smith & Wesson, but firing 45 ACP. It was also Smith & Wesson that pioneered the moon clips, full moon or half moon, to hold the ACP round. And both had experience building something similar for the British in 1915 in their .45 Ely. And these would have a 5.5-inch barrel in American service, and they would definitely be a stopgap and expediency, but they actually proved to be very successful and popular, especially in the trenches of World War I. And they are very similar to each other. They had military-grade blued finishes, simple slab wood grips for the most part, lanyard rings. Now, of course, the Colt would have a cylinder latch you pull back. In the Smith, you press forward. They've, of course, also rotated in opposite directions. Both are single, double action, 6-shot. Most of the Colts had step chambers, but the first 50,000 or so didn't. As far as I know, all the Smith & Wessons did. Maybe some of the very early didn't, but I don't think so. Pretty unchanging. And while Colt would kind of drop the 1917 entirely after the war, Smith & Wesson would actually make some commercially, and they would have a big Brazilian contract as late as 1937, around 25,000 pieces. Now, the reason I put them in this video is because by 1941, the U.S. government, U.S. Armed Forces, still had over 185,000 of these in service. Around 91,000 Smith & Wessons and 96,000 some odd Colts. So enough that it's worth talking about because they were definitely in service in World War II. Now, some, 20,000, 30,000, were given away to Allies, but many were kept at home. If they needed repair replacement, they were phosphated, and they would get plastic grips if the wood ones needed replacing. But some were just put directly into service here. Now, these were not usually sent overseas. They were usually kept at home for guard units, reserve units, and a lot of times they were given or issued to people guarding installations, facilities. Keep in mind, saboteurs were a real concern, and so armed guards that were well trained at critical manufacturing facilities like Colt, like Remington-Rand, were very important, and this was the perfect gun to give to a guard. Americans were more familiar with revolvers. These already existed, they were proven design, and it freed up resources for other things. I should also point out that while the Colt is cool, personally, the Smith & Wesson is what I like. It's actually lighter by a few ounces. You can really tell it when you pick them up. Also, the shape of the grip on the Colt is more extended front to back, and it's a more rounded grip on the Smith. It just fits my hand better. And I even like the cylinder ejection on the Smith better. I'm a Smith & Wesson fan. I make no bones about it. I love these guns. They actually shoot really well. So that's why I decided to bring them out for this video. But the U.S. actually had a pretty extensive hodgepodge of revolvers from all kinds of makes and models in service. And it wouldn't just be old guns recycled for the war. No, there would be contracts for brand new revolvers. And some of them were even better liked than the 1911 automatic. Meet the Colt 1917's younger little brother, the Colt Commando. In December of 1941, Colt had an order for 2,500 38 special revolvers from the government, and that would be followed by a second one early in 1942. They were really slow to deliver these because they were focused on 1911 and other production things. Nevertheless, the government would give them a second contract in August of that year, but they thought the original quoted price for what was essentially just a new service, essentially based on their police models, was too high. So Colt made the Commando version here. Had a 4-inch barrel. Has a blued finish for the most part, but it's a very matte blue because it's a sandblasted. and they have just basic plastic grips. They also eliminated some checkering in a few areas and, refinements, and that got the cost point down. But Colt was still not delivering these very fast. They would scale up revolver production in 1943, and also in that year, a lot of the revolvers like this had been under the DSC, but in 43, the Ordnance Department got involved to kind of hold a standard to it and make sure everything was made the way it should be and being allocated the way it should be and priced the way it should be. Because, well, it was a big deal. Even then, war was a lot of money. So Colt kept having contracts for these, but just never really took hold. One of the final deliveries to the military would be in February of 1944, and then there would be a few more private purchase contracts for security forces, defense contractors in August of 44, bleeding into 45. And I think I said 44 a second ago. I apologize, 45. Anyway, so there'd be a major military delivery at the beginning of that year, then a couple of small contract batches in August, and then there would actually be one final batch of commandos delivered in 46 to private customers. Still under government contract, though. Meaning that they produced just over 50,000 of these, making it a pretty uncommon gun today. This came from a friend, Jerry, a few years back, and I can't say it's one of my absolute most prized pieces, but I really do like it. It's just your good old classic Colt double single action revolver. Like I said, 38 special. And these are really popular with the Navy. Although with so few made, they just kind of got spread out a bit. And a lot of them did go to private security and contract agencies. But, of course, there was one revolver that really made a name for itself in World War II, and that would carry over really to the present day. The Smith & Wesson's younger little brother, the so-called Victory model. And these were produced in much greater numbers before the U.S. was involved in the war included. Generally speaking, it's the same specs as the Commando. Most had the 4-inch barrel, 38 special, 6-shot, double, single action, but produced in much greater numbers. This was based on the company's pre-war M&P military police design, and after the war, this design would become known as the Model 10 in the 1950s. And of course, it's based on the smaller frame, the K-frame style. And this actually started off as a contract for the Commonwealth, the British, and their allies in 38-200, 38 Smith & Wesson, and they would build nearly 600,000 of these for those folks. And that would start around October of 1941. But for the U.S., they would start contracting with Smith & Wesson right after Pearl Harbor, because like I said with the 1911s, they simply did not have enough automatics, and they knew it, and it would take time to set up manufacturing. And at first, they would actually just buy off-the-shelf M&Ps. But then they would start refining the design for mass production. In February of 42, they went to the slab grips. They would go away from the high-polished blued finish all the way to the phosphate finish here, and that would really let them up production. The V was added to the serial once they hit the 1 million number mark, just to give it a different range, and of course V ended up being stood for victory. And kind of like we talked about with the 1903s, these would go to the Marines and the Navy, partially because the Army kind of had a lockdown on new 1911A1 production, but also when and where they were being used, they made a lot of sense and they were greatly liked. Flyers in particular liked the revolver. It was lighter, more compact, and it was felt to be safer than the 1911. Keep in mind, 1911s back then did not have firing pin safeties and other modern safeties we take for granted in automatics. If you wanted to really carry this safe, you could just leave the hammer down on an empty cylinder chamber, and you'd be pretty good. So yeah, naval and marine flyers really are known for carrying the Victory model, and that actually is why a lot of the naval marked ones go for more money. I should point out too that the Army got quite a few, and when they did, these typically would go to the Air Corps, later the Army Air Forces, so even their flyers would often get the Victory model. And of course some would go to defense contractors and private security. Also the Coast Guard, based on their role in the war. This was pretty much the Coast Guard's standard sidearm during and after World War II. And they didn't have a lot of these. They made over 350,000 just for the U.S. alone. You know how I said that the 1911 was felt to be not as safe? Well, one of the more infamous parts about the Victory model was that one of these was dropped on a naval ship and did have an accidental discharge when it was struck and killed a sailor. And in 1944, this really, for a minute, led the Navy to back off from the Smith & Wesson and really refocus on Colt, wanting more commandos. But Smith & Wesson was very quick to respond, introducing a new firing pin hammer safety system. These would be the ones marked with VS. New guns would have that serial. Old guns would have a retrofit with the safety system added. And since Colt was still slower to deliver and a little more expensive on top of that, this allowed the Victory model to kind of remain the preferred 38 caliber revolver. But I had to mention that because it was a very important event in this revolver's career. And these would see their manufacturing end in 1945, around May. Although, like I said, this was just an M&P, simplified for war and given a handy-dandy lanyard ring. That would turn into the Model 10, so in a lot of ways, this is kind of still in production in modern times, or at least its ancestors. And of course, not only would the military keep using the ones they had, they would actually begin refurbishing a lot of revolvers right after World War II. They would be carried throughout Korea and Vietnam, and the Model 10, along with the updated Model 15 with the different sights, would be the standard service gun of the Air Force, really until the Beretta came along. And like I said, this has a 4-inch barrel. The Commonwealth guns typically had a 5, although 6-inch models were known to exist, and even 2-inch models, either factory or cut down, were sometimes carried by like the OSS or certain air crews, including in Vietnam. So 4-inch is standard, but yeah, if you see a 2, it could be original. Chances are it's probably a cut down, but you never know. Just thought I'd point that out. But no, this is also one of my favorite little guns. You don't really hear much about them, and for quite a long time, this was a great way to get a U.S. World War II service gun that has some relevant history for not a price that would break the bank, like say with a 1911 A1. Although I think these days people have kind of cottoned on to them a little bit. But yeah, those are 4 revolver types in service in World War II. There were others, but these are the big ones. And with that, you know, what if you like pistol calibers, but you want a lot more bullets and you want them to go a lot faster out the barrel? Well, that gets us to our next category. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this so far, let me know. Please do like, share, subscribe. Again, check out the Patreon. It really does make my day a lot better when people do, because there's a lot of work that goes into this. I've been at this video all night, and again, I'm still getting over being sick, and my voice is starting to give out on me, but I will persevere because you do support. And if you like this video, this kind of look back at some of the general kit, this is all off the top of my head. This isn't deeply researched stuff, so I apologize for any errors. But if you like it on America, what would you like to see next? We could do Russia, we could do Britain, Germany, of course, Japan, although we've kind of already done that with the big Reising look, Italy, France. Let me know if you do like this style. It's just kind of something to do in between range trips, and if so, which nation? Maybe I'll put up a poll on Patreon. I think I will, assuming people like it. If they don't, then I won't inflict this on you anymore. But with that, let's dive back in. It's time to talk about the Thompson, the Tommy gun, the trench broom, the first submachine gun. Okay, obviously the MP-18, even the Villa Perosa came before it, but those were not called submachine guns in World War I. This was the first gun to actually have that name applied to it in marketing after the war, around 1919. And it was certainly the first gun in its type to be developed and produced in America. And this is the model 1928A1, the first model actually purchased in any numbers by the U.S. Armed Forces. Of course, Thompson himself designed this during World War I, even actually had plans for it before the war kicked off officially. And it was meant to kind of serve the same role as the trench shotgun or the 1918 BAR. Basically get in there and lay down a lot of lead quickly, firing 45 ACP, originally from either 20-round box mags, double stack, double feed, or 50-round, later 100-round drums. And the U.S. was interested. It was kind of part of that whole program with the BAR, the Pedersen device, and on November 9, 1918, Thompson was ready to start shipping these over to Europe. 2 days later, the war was over. So, yeah, none made it over, and after the end of the Great War, the U.S. lost interest, which kind of pushed Thompson Auto Ordnance, at least that was the name at the time, into the police and civilian and foreign markets. There would be some prototypes bouncing around, but the first production model would be the Model 1921, which was made by Colt for Thompson Auto Ordnance. And it was a very nice gun, nickeled internal parts, a high polished blued finish. These actually were not originally straight willowback, they were delayed willowback using the Blish system. They even had wiper pads or oiler pads built in. They had a QD stock. They did not originally have the cuts compensator. That would actually come around 1926, but they did have a thinned barrel for cooling. Of course, originally they had the famous gangster style double pistol grip forward and back. Select fire had a high rate of about 800 rounds per minute, and they were $200, which, if you're wondering what that's about in 2024, a little under $3,500, and that was with one 20-round mag. Presumably drums were extra. The only military branch that purchased these, and it was in quite small numbers, was the Marine Corps. There would actually be a version made for the Army, the 1923, but it didn't go anywhere. Neither did its .45 Thompson cartridge. But, well, like I said, this is the first version used in any numbers for the military. In 1927, the Navy requested 500 from Auto Ordnance. These would originally sometimes be overstamped Colt guns, but later built by Auto Ordnance themselves. Now keep in mind the Navy was also a purchasing agent for the Marine Corps, but they wanted some changes. First and foremost, they wanted a lower rate of fire, which would get down to about 700 RPM. They would make the mass a little heavier, change the recoil springs, you get it. And they would go from the vertical forearm to the horizontal and install sling swivels as a standard. This would become the Model 1928A1. And the Navy would pick some up, but in relatively small numbers. In fact, there'd be small purchases from the Army as well between 1929 and 1934. But this was not a standard issue gun. It was kind of an off-the-shelves purchase. So these were essentially just commercial guns, which kind of explains why they were still very expensive. Finally, in 1938, the U.S. Armed Forces would officially adopt the Thompson after it had been used to reasonably good success in Nicaragua, making it really the U.S. Armed Forces' first submachine gun. But the initial purchase price was $209. Hopefully they at least got some extra mags for that, because considering it was in 1938-39 during the Depression, that actually adjusts out to $4,666. That's a lot of fucking money. But yeah, they did get some drums, but they didn't like them. They were big, they were heavy, they were hard to not only load the drum, but also load it into the gun. You needed the third hand. So in effect, they used the 20-round mags, and they carried them in 5-cell pouches. So 100 rounds per pouch. And these would go to Army Rangers. Paratroopers would soon pick them up. Other reconnaissance forces, some tank crews and other vehicle crews. NCOs would often carry a Thompson. And production would ramp up, of course, with World War II. Soon, these would be made by Auto Ordnance, being joined by Savage. And they would keep on going. Of this model, the 1928 A1, they would build over 570,000 total, with a good chunk of those going to the armed forces. Here and there, a lot of them saw use in the Pacific. But people rightly pointed out, this thing's heavy. With the cuts compensator, it's around 33 inches, but it weighs almost 11 pounds unloaded. That's thanks to the good old forged receiver. And it's not exactly a light barrel, stock, what have you. And they also pointed out that the 45 ACP round kind of lacked stopping power, penetration out past about 50 yards, give or take. Dense foliage would also stop it. And again, they didn't really care for the drum, so only having 20-round mags, especially with the rate of fire of still 700 or so RPM, meant that, it kind of burned through the ammo quite quickly. That's not to completely dissuade it, but it was not a perfect gun. But I think really the big drawback was the cost, which kind of takes us to a very interesting footnote in U.S. military history. Because up next, when World War II began, there were actually 2 submachine guns being manufactured in the USA. The Thompson and the Reising. This was the brainchild of Eugene Reising, who actually was a student of John Browning's, and for a time it held the record for the most compact and lightweight submachine gun in the world. And it had some very interesting innovations, and in some ways was better than the Thompson. Unfortunately, its pros did not outweigh its cons. And one of those was its manufacturer, Harrington and Richardson, H&R. Reising began development of his submachine gun, chambered for 45 ACP in 1938, kind of seeing the detractions of the Thompson and wanted to give it some competition. And in 1940, he partnered with H&R to build this. But remember, I said, talking about the 1911 A1, H&R was having some production issues at the time. Wasn't exactly the company's highlight point. Nevertheless, the initial M50, the select fire fixed stock version, would be in production by March of 1941. And later on that year, they would introduce the M55, which was a folding stock version with a wire folder. They had a barrel of 11 inches, give or take a cut-style compensator. Some would have it, some wouldn't. So a little bit shorter on the Paratrooper version, if you want to call it that, without there. And they would introduce the M60 as an 18-inch barrel, which was the minimum length at the time. Some automatic-only version. Not just for the civilian market, but some law enforcement departments that may not want or need a full auto, or guards, or, whoever else. And, yeah. So they were in production. Interesting because it's a closed bolt gun, whereas the Thompson in full auto was open bolt. It was select fire. But it was made with a lot of stampings. You had, of course, a machined tube, but then things like the rear sight were stamped, the mag catch stamped, trigger guard stamped. Early versions had fins on the barrel. Later ones, these could go away. Some would have stock grooves, some wouldn't. And they were quite light, under 7 pounds for the M50 and under 6.5 pounds for the M55. So that beat the Thompson there. They also beat the Thompson on price. Originally, the U.S. government was going to pay about $62, which in 1941, $42, translated to today, would be about $1,300. But through manufacturing changes and expediencies and kind of economy of scale, this was reduced to about $950 in today, or $50 back then. So yeah, a lot better than what the Thompson's doing. So what's the problem? In 1942, right after the war kicked off, the U.S. Army, Marines, Navy, all tested the Reising because, well, the Thompson was the only other game in town and everyone needs submachine guns. The Army outright rejected it. The Marines and the Navy, though, again, really together since the Marines are being kind of purchased for by the Navy, took it because they didn't have any other choice. And this would be for the war in the Pacific. And they were very quickly sent over because these were available for Guadalcanal, which kicked off in August of that year. But while in the beginning, this fact that it was a closed bolt meant it was actually quite good on the accuracy. And it was well respected and liked for its lighter weight and relatively compact size. The shortcomings really popped out. One that's kind of cool, and I really respect the innovation, is the charging here. When you look down here, it's on the underside of the forearm. Sorry, my sling's in the way, which actually is one of the problems. They quickly found that while that's a really interesting and ergonomic place to charge, sometimes in the heat of things, the sling would cover up the port. Not something that was completely a deal breaker, but, it was an issue. On the other hand, so was the magazine. This used its own mag. It might kind of at first look like a Thompson mag, but it's just 20 rounds, and it's double stack single feed, unlike the Thompson. One fun fact, and this was not all production models, but some, the mag catch is either a pull or a push. This was one of the innovations introduced. Now notice this is a stamped component. This mag well is also pretty loose, but yeah. And these mags, in addition to being relatively low capacity, at least the Thompson had the option for a drum, weren't the most reliable, or even all the time the easiest to load. And the solution didn't make things a lot better. This is it, a 12-round mag, essentially turning this into a straight single stack, single feed system. Now, to be fair, the military didn't have a lot of these. It was mostly used by police agencies and guard units stateside, but this was a solution. But while 20 rounds was already kind of limiting for a submachine gun, 12 was downright silly, at least in select fire. I mean, yes, this did have a slower cyclic rate than the Thompson, 500, 550 rounds. Quite a bit slower. But even at that low rate, 12 rounds would go very quickly. Here's one of the pouches. It holds 3 mags each, either type. There you have it. Of course, being a closed bolt did have one advantage in the Pacific. It did keep debris out of the action, or salt, or water, more than an open bolt would have. But it wasn't enough. Already on Guadalcanal, issues started to appear, and really the Solomon Islands campaigns solidified it. Parts of these were corroding very quickly in salt water. Firing pins were brittle, prone to breakage. Extractors, ejectors weren't doing much better. In fact, they had trouble with just interoperability of parts. You could take apart 10 Reisings, swap parts around, and they may or may not fit. In theory, they should have, but they didn't. And they were a little harder to clean and maintain than a Thompson. Even though the gun was cheaper, lighter, in a lot of ways simpler, the actual mechanism, because it is a closed bolt, here's your selector, was more complicated. So all in all, maintenance was just pretty rigid on these. I should point out that these could have polished blue to finish early on, matte blue, later on even phosphate. Typically you had your semi-pistol grip stock here, but again there was the M55 folder. Interestingly, there's some small evidence that the the Marines even had some M60 semi-automatic onlys, and some of them might have even been on Guadalcanal, just because they had them and nothing else. It was kind of a take what you can find type situation. Well, it was better than nothing, and before they get really dirty and needed a lot of cleaning and whatnot, okay, once these saw heavy use in combat, they just didn't hold up, and H&R could not deliver enough spare parts, so it was a stopgap at the best of times. The Marines would acquire these in 1942 into 43. Around 100,000 were sold to the government, with about 80,000 going to the Marines themselves, the others going to the Navy, maybe some to the Coast Guard, a lot to guard units and that kind of thing as well. It was just an interim solution. Already by the end of 1943, the remaining ones were being pulled out of frontline service. And I say the remaining Reisings because a lot of these accidentally fell overboard off small boats, landing craft, into bathtubs, I don't know. Again, while maybe they were quite happy to get it early on, very quickly this earned a pretty deserved reputation for not being something you want to trust your life or your mate's life to. So by 1944, they were out of frontline service. They were just kept stateside for guard duty. Some were given to the OSS, some to allies like Canada. And believe it or not, as much as I make the Reising sound kind of meh, and production was wrapped up around 1945 with about 120,000 total built by H&R, these were actually brought back in the 50s, and they built more. That's because, while it wasn't a good gun for the Marines in the Pacific, it was actually a really good law enforcement carbine, be it the semi-automatic only or the select fire. Because it wasn't seeing the rigors of the environment, the salt water, being kept in a trunk or a locker. It had a familiar design, closed bolt. The charging system was, better when you weren't really needing to worry about slings. The lightweight police officers cared for. It kind of found a niche there. That's why they actually brought it back. You don't see many World War II era guns coming back after their production ended. I had to give it just desserts because it wasn't all bad. It really wasn't. And Eugene Reising's ideas were pretty interesting. Again, this was early days of submachine guns. It really was. So the idea of like stampings and even firing from a closed bolt for this kind of gun, pretty innovative, for all things considered. It's just a shame that H&R's quality control wasn't up to the task of making the parts fully, exchangeable, interoperable, and that it was truly a rush job. Keep in mind, when this went in for military testing, it had just been in production for a year or so. So, you gotta cut it a little slack. But I find it a cool part of history. I do like marine history, and the Reising is certainly one of that. It's pretty unique and identifiable with them. But it wasn't going to be the Thompson killer. No, the Thompson would definitely soldier on, although it would start to look a little different. I like the look of the 1928 A1, but this, when I think Thompson, is what comes to mind. The M1 and the subsequent M1A1. These were Thompsons made for the U.S. military, and tried to address some of the things. They weren't just a cheaper alternative, although that was the big deal. But one of the first things they did in December of 1941, the Auto Ordnance Company made a 30-round mag, essentially an extended 20, to try to compromise between the 50-round drum and that. This also allowed for a new 3-cell pouch, so you had a total of 90 rounds in one pouch versus 100 in this, but you have a much smaller, lighter pouch. And that was still with the 1928 A1. Also, towards the end of the A1's purchase from the government, they got rid of the thinned barrel, and even the cuts compensator disappeared on some. So this kind of smooth barrel could be on late 1928 A1s. But they were just beginning the changes. Around February-March 1942, Savage, who was a maker of the Thompson, of course, offered a simplified version. And this would go into testing and soon be adopted as the M1. And the barrel aside, we have the same forearm, but we have simplified controls here. These are, well, a lot less fancy than what came before, saving a lot of time. And we have a different receiver. Notice the step here. And we have a simplified rear sight. Now this is the style without the protective ears, just a stamping. Later, a version with the kind of side walls ears would be introduced, usually with the M1A1, because this was a little too simplified, frankly, for hard use, but it did save a lot, because having a really finely adjustable sight on a submachine gun didn't exactly make a lot of sense. Flipping it over, of course, the original is a top cocker with a finely knurled bolt handle and with the pass-through for the sights. We go to a simple, unadorned cylindrical charging system on the side, which of course saves a lot of time. This kind of cut receiver style also saves weight. But a big deal here is this can no longer accept drums. The military never much liked them, nor did the soldiers. So the receiver and lower frame lack the rails and gobbledygook for the drum. Which, yeah. And they, like I say, got rid of the cuts compensator, which brought the barrel from around 12 inches down to about 10.5, bringing the overall length from about 33 inches down to 32. And while this is still a heavy gun, it went from being nigh on 11 pounds to a little over 10 pounds. So it didn't quite save a pound, but all things considered, every bit does help. But the big deal, well, that's the reduction in cost. The big advantage, of course, was the price. This reduced it by 2/3. The M1, thanks to economy of scale, the simplifications, Savage stepping in, was $70 in 1942. That's about 1,350 or less in today's money. So almost as cheap as the initial Reising. But it even got better, because in October of 1942, the M1A1 was introduced. Now, the original M1 still had a floating firing pin, and so it had the striker system to ignite that. The M1A1 went to the fixed firing pin, like we see on most submachine guns today, outside of the MP5, of course, meaning a lot of mechanism could be deleted. Also, by this point, the old Blish system and all that, the delay system, totally gone. So much simpler inside. And in fact, in 1944, February, when the final military contract was given, the cost per submachine gun was down to $45. That's just under $800 in today's money. So it was actually cheaper than the wartime version of the Reising. So that's pretty good. And the M1A1 kind of further helped the design, because going to the solid bolt system with the fixed firing pin had the side effect of reducing the rate of fire down to about 620 rounds per minute. That, combined with 30-round mag, just kind of gave it a better extension as far as usefulness. The Thompson was definitely popular. The Army Rangers used them, like I said, tank and vehicle crews. The paratroopers, especially as D-Day loomed, really became fond of them. It's primarily identified with its use in Europe. It proved to be very good at close-quarter combat in the streets and houses of occupied France and elsewhere. These were used by the Marines in the Pacific as kind of a limited standard. And while they did like them, they discovered that the dense foliage often kind of deflected the .45 caliber round and limited its effectiveness. So while it was reasonably well liked there, it was actually replaced by the much harder hitting 1918 A2 BAR by 1943 or so. I'm just talking in general. I know that Thompson still remained around. But my entire point is, Europe is really where this shone. It also makes sense because actually Britain and Sweden each had adopted it as a limited standard, purchasing some right before the war. And France was going to, as was Yugoslavia, but, well, the war got in the way. Again, this was one of the few commercially available submachine guns before the war, so its reputation carried over. And they would build roughly 1,400,000 M1 and M1A1s during the war, with the final guns delivered in 1945. That meant in total, you had a little under 200,000 bought by the U.S. government, most going to our own armed forces, but some given as lend-lease to places like Russia, too, so not all of them went into our hands. But there was an effort to make an even cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce submachine gun to equip American troops. And it took inspiration from the British. The M3 grease gun, which I do not have. The kits have always been way too expensive, and even making one into Samato has just been problematic. It's just one that's eluded me, unfortunately. I did have one of the Valkyries years ago, even did a video on it, but such is life. But here's a Sten gun, because that's really what the grease gun M3 is. It's an American Sten gun with the exact same idea. Stamping as much as possible, cheap as possible, just basic. It was first accepted for service at the tail end of 1942, with initial production in 1943. The grease gun was actually made by GM Motors, their Guidelamp division. So, yeah, essentially a light manufacturer, a headlight manufacturer. And it was light, at least not quite as light as the Reising, but lighter than the Thompson, at around 8 pounds, give or take which version. It was compact at under 30 inches, and about 22 with the stock retracted. But it had an 8-inch barrel, so a little shorter barrel, firing .45 ACP, still good enough. And it was mostly stampings, and it was cheap, especially once they got the thing all up and running. Only about $20 per gun by 1944, which translates to just over $350 in today's money. So even by today's standards, yeah, it feels very cheap. They did run into some early problems, one of which was resolved. It was the weird kind of crank-style charging system. This would result in the M3A1 appearing at the very end of 1944. So just going to the simple stick your finger in and cock the bolt worked. Most of your original M3s were updated. Another one, though, was the mags. Another thing inherited from the Sten. Double stack, single feed, like we talked about the Reising. They're a little harder to load, which is why built-in tool was in the stock of the grease gun. And it's just not as reliable as a Thompson mag. But, oh well. And it was not select fire. It was just full auto only. But it had a rate of fire of only about 450 rounds a minute, which is the kind of iconic chug it makes. Slow enough rate of fire, you can really control it even without having a selector switch. Pros and cons to it. But the truth is, by the time it was available, it really didn't start to appear in theater, the original M3, until 1944, by which time the war was going in favor of the Allies. And the M3A1 did not appear until 1945, really not until the war was already over. So it was a good effort, but by the time it really appeared, it wasn't really needed. GM-Guidelamp would build about 626,000 M3s during the war, with another 16,000 M3A1s before the war was over. And then in Korea, Ithaca, remember them, would turn out another 33,000 M3A1s, and most all of the original M3s were updated to M3A1 standard during refurbishment. Even though the M3 didn't really make an impact on World War II as such, the M1A1 Thompson, plus newer developments and other guns, kind of made it redundant. It would actually stay in service, not just through Korea and Vietnam, but it would remain in tanks all the way through 1991 and the Gulf War, although it would be taken out shortly thereafter. In fact, a friend actually served in that war and had grease guns in his tank, and yes, he had to qualify with them. He was a 20-year guy, so he had plenty of time with the grease gun. So they were still around, and while they were just stamped metal, since they didn't see a lot of frontline heavy combat, they lasted. I mean, one benefit of being simple like a Sten, they didn't rig. And whereas the Sten did have a selector switch, by the way, this is not functional, this is just for effect, YouTube. The grease gun didn't, so that's just one less part to break and go wrong, because there were definitely stories about the Sten being a little chancy. Well, maybe one day I'll end up with a grease gun, but such is life, guys. I do my best for you. But with that, we've talked about bolt-action rifles, we've gone through handguns, we've made it through the submachine guns. So let's return to some, well, I was going to say bigger, but not really bigger, rifles. A firearm from my recent top 10 video, the M1 Carbine. I really appreciate this gun. It was really the most mass-produced of World War II from America, and in a lot of ways, I think it was the most forward-thinking, perhaps even more than the M1 Garand in a lot of ways. It's not to say it doesn't have its limitations and whatnot, but it was, well, never meant to be an ultimate. It goes all the way back to 1938 when the U.S. Ordnance Department wanted a new light rifle. The M1 Garand was just coming into service, and, well, some had reservations. It was still in its teething phase. Even those who supported it realized it could be heavy and cumbersome for certain situations. Meanwhile, the Thompson was just heavy and expensive, and the 1911 and Revolvers had their own limitations. So a light, handy carbine would be great. Meanwhile, it actually begins with Winchester. Ed Browning was working on a design for them, the M2, Well, Ed passed away soon thereafter, leaving his design, and this is where David Williams comes in. He gives a short stroke tappet gas piston system to Ed Browning's designs, but then has to change the bolt system to a style similar to the one Garand. It's a whole thing, a lot back and forth. This video is trying to condense things down. So in 1940, the U.S. government releases specs. They want a weapon that can reach out to about 300 yards. It needs to be select fire, at the very least self-loading. And it needs to fire a new 30 caliber cartridge they're working on. Oh, and it needs to weigh under 5 pounds. Now, the idea was to start trials in February of 1941, but the cartridge wasn't ready yet, so nothing really happened until May of that year. And originally, Winchester did not want to submit a design. They had other projects, other things going on. Other companies did. We would actually see submissions throughout the year from Colt and Garand himself. But Winchester became involved in July. They had asked the Ordnance Department to look at their latest 30-06, and they weren't really interested in that, but they liked the design, and they said, hey, this would scale down to the new 30 caliber, which is 7.62 by 33, quite well. So in under 2 weeks, designers at Winchester did a very rough sketch of what would become the M1 Carbine. And in August, the Ordnance Department took a look at this and really, really liked it. So there would be more trials with some prototypes and concepts from Winchester, and it would finally be adopted in October of 1941, beating out, like I said, competition from several other makers. And even before Pearl Harbor, not only was Winchester going to make this, but GM's division Inland. But of course, once Pearl Harbor happened, 8 more contractors were brought on board to build this new class of little gun. So, well, it is a little bit over 5 pounds, but only by a few ounces, so really close. Overall length is under 36 inches, so under a yard. Barrel of 18 inches. It uses, like I said, a modified Garand style rotating bolt, a short stroke tappet gas piston system under the barrel. Very simple 2-position L rear sight. And one of the big deals here was it used a detachable magazine. Okay, today it's very common, but back then, not so much. Straight in insertion in what today we would consider drop free. Double stack, double feed. Typical pouch held 2. There's several styles over the years. And while it doesn't have an automatic last round hold open, it does have a manual one on the bolt here, this little pin. It's better than nothing. And let it go. One feature that I always found kind of peculiar, but not bad, was the sling and oiler arrangement here as well. There's your oiler in the stock. And it doubles as the sling swivel in the rear. Again, weight and simplicity were very important. This was designed for those who may not be carrying a rifle as their primary weapon. So basically what today we would call a PDW. It was also going to be used as a pistol replacement because it was easier and faster to train new recruits how to use this over most handguns. And in a lot of ways, the M1 Carbine was even cheaper, at least once production really was up and running. And, of course, the 30 caliber round in a 15 round mag gave some more oomph and firepower than 45, especially at range. Now, of course, no bayonet lug, simple, protected front sight. This is an early example, or at least in a World War II configuration, and it's from one of my favorite manufacturers, IBM. I know a lot of people go for the Winchesters, I get it. They're cool, but I don't know, always had a soft spot for the IBM ones. But they were all made to the same standard. And not only were parts interchangeable, the manufacturers routinely shared parts. If one was lacking something but another manufacturer had excess, they swapped. Because that was the idea, to crank these out. And they definitely did. Like I said, when Pearl Harbor kicked off, they were just setting up production, but already by early 1942, examples were out and on the way. And would it surprise you to learn that the European theater, the Western theater, would kind of get priority? The Pacific, well, they would have to wait a little while, but they would make it there as well. And they cranked them up. And by 1943, they were going. And we would start to see variations and changes and improvements and cost simplifications. And in May of 1942, a very famous variation would first appear. The M1A1 Paratroopers Carbine. In its case. Well, reproduction case, but that's okay, because it's a reproduction carbine, too. This is one of those modern-day inland manufacturing ones. I've never picked up an original because I've always been worried about it not being correct, paying the money, and then figuring out. Because the problem is, there were no special serials. Here it is with one of the later style pouches with the wider strap. Many people fit these around M1 carbine stocks, but they're actually made for the standard belt at the time. Anywho, the stock is, well, it's more rigid than the Reising. 2 struts made of steel. It just kind of locks in either position with friction. There's not really a button. I think it's kind of neat how the oiler was moved over here to the cheek piece. And again, we just have a non-locking folding butt plate. We have essentially a standard stock till you get here, then it's lobbed off. And we have a wood pistol grip. And like I said, these were first selected, tried out in May of 42, and the first production models were turned out of inland at the very end of 1942, and there would be a production run into the middle or end of 1943 for the first batch. And the first place I believe these are trialed out was in Sicily, that campaign. And there would be a second production run, which this is more representative of, beginning in April of 44, running through the end of that year, give or take. No bayonet lug on it still, but it does have the kind of second pattern band with the wire swivel. Has the 4-rivet handguard, which is a later thing. This one has the round bolt, which was introduced in 1944, and it has the adjustable rear sight, which came around late that year. And it has one other thing, a so-called low wood stock. This is the quote-unquote high wood. In 1944, low wood came around. And it still has the push button safety, and of course mag catch is the same. Leather cheek piece, brass rivets. I really do think that Ellen did a good job with these. I've had several reproductions over the years. Auto Ordnance sold some years back. You know, if you can find an original and you know it's real, that's great. But the truth is, Inland just pulled receivers off the line. So aside from just knowing it's in the right date range, which is a pretty good chunk of the whole production process, it's really hard to know if that gun left the factory with this stock on it, because that's the difference. These were first given to the 101st and 82nd Airborne units. Later on, they would go to others, And even the Marine Corps would finally get some too. How nice is that? And they were issued with the standard 15-round mag. And as is famously known, these were used on D-Day. They weren't the only guns that dropped in. A lot of Thompsons were there, for example. But it was a very compact weapon, and it gave a lot of close-in firepower. 30 caliber carbine, you can argue good or bad at range, but up close and personal, it's lighter, recoiling, generally speaking more accurate, and plenty hard hitting. In fact, some have kind of likened it, saying it's in the general ballpark of a .357 Magnum, so take that as you will. I just think it's a really cool variation. And I have one more to show you, and we can talk about some changes while we're at it. Here we have my Underwood. I think it's kind of cool. We have something from a typewriter manufacturer. And it continues to have the changes. Another later one was the switch from a button to a lever safety that pivots. YouTube doesn't like safeties being messed with, so I'll, well, not, but, you know, instead of pushing a button, you can rotate it 90 degrees. The idea was sometimes soldiers could mix up safety and mag catch, and bad things result. Another thing introduced in 1944 was an extended 30-round mag, although these did not become common until a little later. And here is the 4-pocket pouch for 30-round mags, giving quite the capacity, firepower. And why did you need that? Well, in the latter half of 1944, the M2 carbine appeared. Now, from the beginning, the notion of making this select fire, semi-automatic or full automatic, was there. But to speed things up, they just dropped that requirement back in 1941. But it was always in the back of their minds. In the beginning, they issued the T-17 and the T-18 conversion kits to give a standard gun select fire capability. So that was actually built in to the M1 from the get-go. But then they started producing versions with the selector switch. Now, just to YouTube, this is a dummy switch. It's a real switch. It's demilled at the bottom, and it's actually attached to the stock, not the gun. So you're cool. They even introduced kind of a thicker stock for these. And, you know, double the capacity. And these were employed. They were famously used on Okinawa in 1945. And they would actually lead directly to the M3, which was an M2 with a very early night vision optic on there. And those two, again, did see some limited use at the end of World War II in the Pacific. Really cool and pioneering. At least I think so. And you'll notice, of course, this version does have a bayonet lug, unlike the previous two. Instead of giving guys with M1 carbines a bayonet or an old school trench knife, beginning in early 1943, they were issued this, the M3 fighting knife, combat knife. Used the standard M8, M8A1 scabbard. Early versions used a slightly earlier version, but click went to that. It's a relatively short blade. It was actually designed to conserve on steel, and it really is just a fighting knife. It's not really a multi-purpose utility knife. It's for, yeah. With these cool leather ring grips. I think these are really cool. So they would carry these instead of a bayonet. But in 1944, they changed it up a bit. In early summer of that year, this was introduced. The M4 bayonet. As you can see, very, very much the same, just with a different cross piece and some latches added to the back. as little unchanged as possible. Because they felt with the M1 Carbine and now the M2 coming out shortly, it was time to give them a bayonet that was lightweight. But since this was meant to be used as a personal defense weapon, it was really that last line of defense for the soldier. So once the M4 was in production, the M3 was taken out by August, September of 1944. And here it is on the gun. I'm sure this was used for parade stuff based on the finish. I actually had a parade sling that was white with chromed or nickeled hardware for a carbine. Yeah, it's an ad hoc thing, but it works. And they would keep using the M4s, even making new ones in the 50s, but they would go away from the leather grips to plastic. And if you notice, this bayonet style closely resembles what we'd see later for the M14 and M16, and really kind of influenced what's to come. So that's why I wanted to mention it in the video, just because it's kind of a trendsetter. Plus, I just kind of like talking M1 carbines. Why not? My video, right? Some other neat devices for the M1 carbine, M2 carbine, M3 were muzzle attachments, but you'll notice there's no threads. So what they did, it was a clamp-on. This was intended for the M2, the select fire, and is a very robust muzzle brake. It hinges over and tightens down with the wing nut here, like so. Slip it over, hinge it down, tie it on. And since it's actually got the sight base between it, it's not going to go flying off. Pretty neat, I think. And it worked okay as a brake. If nothing else, the extra mass on the end helped. Of course, with it on, you can't use the bayonet lug. They also did a flash hider, a conical style, which I do have one. I don't know where I put it. I looked before doing this video. It's somewhere. I've seen it quite recently, but I'm sure I'll find it 5 minutes after finishing the video. But yeah, those are my guns. These would see service all throughout World War II. First again in Europe, then the Pacific. Many were given as Lend-Lease to our allies before and after the war. And many were dropped behind enemy lines to help arm resistance fighters, partisan fighters, that kind of thing. They were cheap enough, light enough, easy enough to use. Really, the only detraction from it was the cartridge. 30 caliber carbine. It was non-corrosive, that was good. And the cartridge did have a bit of a taper, but it wasn't a true bottleneck. And it was a round-nosed bullet, not a Spitzer. But in other ways, the gun was really ahead of its time. The mags worked pretty well. They did wear out some, but then again, they were produced in huge numbers and reasonably disposable. The M1, M1A1, and my mock M2, they would actually build only 140,000 original M1A1s in 2 runs, like I said. And they would build about 600,000, give or take, select fires. In total, between late 1941 and 1945, over 6.25 million carbines were built. Now, most makers would do them between 42 and 44, even 43 and 44. By the end of 1944, all the contracts have been stopped except for Inland and Winchester. They would make theirs a little bit longer. But no new M1 carbines were made after World War II. But that's not to say they didn't continue to serve. They most certainly did. They were used very heavily in Korea. And many were still in service with especially the Air Force, like guard guns, but also some SOG units in Vietnam. More importantly, though, like I said, they were given or sold or lent to allies right after World War II and up through South Vietnam and many others, including Israel and such and so forth. They weren't actually officially retired in the U.S. military until 1970, but even then they were in second-line use and reserve use, and other militaries would keep them in service even longer. Not bad for a gun designed initially to be cheap and, frankly, to be disposable. This was an expedient of the war, not something really built exactly to last, but they have. I find this gun extremely interesting, and in a lot of ways, it's the forerunner of the assault rifle. If the MP44, the Sturmgewehr, is the first true mass-produced one, this is kind of showing indications. In fact, its cartridge can be said to have inspired 8mm Kurz, which itself inspired 7.62 by 39. Don't know. What do you think, though? Do you have the appreciation for the M1 Carbine like I do? Or am I just crazy? Well, I know I'm crazy, but, aside from that, I've had a lot of fun with these over the years. But, of course, when people think of America, World War II, this isn't the M1. No, not the M1 Thompson either. No. We're going to end this video by looking at the granddaddy of them all. Saving the best for last? Many would think so. The U.S. Rifle M1. .30 caliber 30-06 7.62 by 63 Springfield, as it was known in Europe and much of the rest of the world. An iconic battle rifle, and really the first self-loading rifle to be adopted, put into full production, and actually become standard issue for a major military. Now, Russia, of course, had the AVS-36, which led to the SVT-38 and SVT-40. Those are the two nations really pushing self-loading infantry rifles ahead before the Second World War. And, of course, the story begins at the end of World War I. The Great War, as it was known. Hopefully the war to end all wars. But, didn't happen. The U.S. had considered self-loading standard issue infantry rifles. Now, the French had the RSC 1917, which led to the RSC 1918. And the Americans looked at what was around, and they just didn't like what was on offer. They figured anything built durable enough to shoot thousands of rounds and go up with the rigors of the doughboys would be too heavy. They weren't wrong. Look at the Browning, the BEAR, the 1918, and really the 1918 A2, which was, to be fair, a light machine gun more than a rifle. On the other hand, if you made a gun light enough, say under 10 pounds, and a self-loader, they were concerned that it just wouldn't hold up to the rigors. Again, they weren't exactly wrong. That was one of the problems with the SVT-38 and even SVT-40. So they kind of shelved it for a minute. And after World War I, the U.S. really wasn't into much in the way of military procurement anyway. But time would march on, and in the early 1920s, a gentleman from Canada named John C. Garand would begin working for Springfield. And this would lead to a competition that would last a decade between himself and Thompson to develop a self-loading GI rifle. And it was going to be chambered in .276 Pedersen. A lot of names keep popping up here of Pedersen device fame, different caliber, but same basic points. Anyway, they would test these out, and around 1926-27, Garand would go not to the gas system here with a piston, but would use the Bang gas trap system, which was really preferred before the war because they had this hang-up, as did many other militaries, Germany included, about drilling holes for gas ports in barrels. They just didn't know what they'd do to accuracy. So the original T1 chambered in the Patterson cartridge would fire that, and it would go up against an offering from Thompson. And they would go head-to-head in several rounds. There'd be improvements back and forth. This isn't a high priority. 1931, 1932, back and forth. In the end of 32, it's recommended let's adopt the T1 in .276 for the next standard issue rifle. So that was the plan, but in 1933, General MacArthur, sorry, I've been talking for a while, you might have noticed, along with others, decided, no. Yeah, the 276 works well, but we've got a ton of 30-06 ammo. Let's use that. So an order was given, let's not go with the new cartridge and new rifle. Let's do the old cartridge, although they would adopt the M2 ball a couple of years later and do it that way. That would lead to the T1E2 prototype. It would be tested in 1934. They would send a small batch of pre-production models to the field for testing and whatnot. They would have issues. They would refine the design, 1935, tinker with this and that, and at the end of that year it was cleared for production. And it was officially adopted in July of 1936, but because this was a radically new design at Springfield, they really wouldn't start handing over the earliest production guns to the Army until 1937. And would you guess it? Still had issues. Yeah, if you read the history between that time and around 1940, there are recalls and going back and tinkering with this, tinkering with that, really culminating in the switch when it was authorized in 1939 to go away from the bang system to a much more familiar to us today, long stroke gas piston system with the big old canted over op rod. To me, this is why the gas system, at least the piston, is a little awkward on the Garand because it's asymmetrical. But either way, that was ordered in 39, and it would take them a couple of years to pull back the guns that were already out there in the depots and refit them from the bang system to the gas piston system. Only a handful of gas trap Garands in original configuration exist today, although more guns that were once gas trap and were converted are out there. Once Springfield kind of had the kinks worked out, Winchester was contracted with to be the second manufacturer. And by 1941, even before the war, both were up and running. And by the time of Pearl Harbor, Springfield was making upwards of 600 per day. And it would just, go on from there throughout the war. And this really was revolutionary for its day and time. But it could have been better. I'm not going to dwell on this gun too much. We looked at it in that recent British video. This is one of those British guns made in early 1942. Still has the lock bar, rear sight, milled trigger guard, original walnut furniture. It has a 24-inch barrel, overall length of just under 44 inches, so about the same as the Springfield bolt action. Weight, well, they didn't quite get it under 9 pounds as they originally had hoped, but it was under 10 pounds, about 9.5, give or take the exact manufacturer and everything. So technically even lighter than a Thompson, which is hilarious to me. The Thompson's kind of our heaviest thing, even though it's shorter. And I can understand the going from .276 Patterson to 30-06 because that was the standard and the U.S. had millions of rounds and the military was on a strict budget in the 1930s. Something we haven't been able to enjoy in decades now, really almost a century. But the one thing that I just don't know about was the magazine system. Of course, this uses the famous en-bloc system. Load in a packet of 8, get your hand out of the way, and let it go. This was really at the request of the Army. They didn't want a magazine hanging down. So this was the solution. I think a better one could have been hit upon. One of the problems is you can't really top off this magazine, and it's not really comfortable to load less than 8 rounds. Yes, I know you can. You can do an en bloc with 4 rounds in it or whatever, but it's not the easiest thing to get in there successfully. Just so they couldn't get quite low. I think a detaching mag, even if it was just a 10-rounder, it wouldn't hang down much further. You could have had swapping mags out. It could have worked. On the other hand, again, kind of looking at the economics, they thought this would be a cheaper, more dependable system. the idea of detaching mags was pretty new. They did actually have some trials guns that used 20-round BAR mags. And the BAR mag, even though the BAR itself was super overbuilt, the BAR mag is kind of flimsy, so it could be that kind of gave them a negative taste in their mouth. But later, Beretta would prove that a magazine-fed Garand could definitely work with the BM-59 series. Even though this gun didn't make it into my top favorites video, the BM-59 did, so that pretty much counts, right? I've also kind of thought it's a little strange having this external moving part here, just getting your hand in there. I don't know. Looking back, we can kind of criticize, but back in the day, this was really the best self-loading rifle. Full power, full oomph that had come into the world for a military. So in 1942, Springfield and now Winchester were up and running making these, and they would make a lot. During World War II, roughly 4.5 million were turned out before manufacturing was halted in 1945. And as we've kind of already gone through in this video, the Army would get priority, which would lead to these first going to the European, North African theaters. But the Marine Corps would eventually get theirs as well, and these would make their way to the Pacific just a little bit later, which is why we had more 1903s, Reisings, and other things over there. Again, also the environment. Europe was just much more amenable to the Garand, which makes sense because at its roots, this is a World War I gun, at least the idea behind it. The Pacific wasn't really something planned for. By the way, when I did that video on this British Garand, apparently people don't have a sense of humor. I made a joke about after Dunkirk and the British not having guns, using sticks, stones, and bows and arrows. I forgot. It's a joke, you damn Vulcan. I wasn't serious. Granted, I'm not the smartest person out there, but it was a joke. But, come on, it's the British. You know if Jerry tried to come across the channel, they would have damn well thrown sticks and stones and shot at him with bows and arrows, just because. I mean, the Welsh and Scottish are a thing. Anyway, I'm allowed to have fun and jokes. Keeps things much more interesting for me and you both. Anyway, those are the two makers in World War II, and what can I say about it? It's the M1 Garand. I should have drug out my bayonets. You had the original long type based on the bolt-action bayonets like the 1905, and then you had the later short M5 type, which was kind of inspired by the M1 Carbine, but I didn't. There was never a Paratrooper version of this, but we did get a couple of snipers. Appearing in the summer of 1944, first you had the M1C, followed by the M1D, with the big difference being a simpler and frankly better mounting system for the optic. But yeah, this whole loading system of on-block clips did complicate mounting a scope. You had to use the sidewall, yada yada yada. These never replaced the 03A4 during the war, but their use was much more common in Korea. Most of the M1Ds and even M1Cs I see have more Korean going on, but they were there for the last year or so of World War II, so I wanted to give them credit. And that was really the only major variant. Outside of testing, we never had a detaching mag variant or select fire variant. Now, this was a very focused gun, and really from beginning to end, quality was very high. I'd say if there's one area that you can kind of find roughness on these, especially in 1942, it's actually the gas cylinder, this area up here. This one's a little rough from Springfield, but I've seen some Winchesters that are very interesting. Stock stayed the same. Large cleaning kit in the butt. The Garand is definitely a cool gun. The first time I shot one, I was 6 years old. So that's the thing. Maybe that explains why I like carbines so much. So production would end in 1945, but with millions in inventory, this would very much be the U.S.'s standard frontline gun for years, even decades to come. And because we had so many, and because Europe needed to be re-equipped, this would be given as lend-lease, loaned, sold different ways, all throughout the world. And that made 30-06 the de facto standard for the Western world, the first world if you prefer, until 7.62 NATO 308 came along. But, well, the war that I don't think anyone really wanted would come about in the second half of 1950, Korea. And we needed more Grands, but there was a problem. While Springfield still had the capacity, the production line, to make new Garands, and did, beginning in 1950, as well as refurbishing and updating older ones, the Winchester tooling, the production line, had actually been sold off to Italy in 1949, so about a year earlier, give or take. This is why we have the BM-59, so I'm actually very grateful for this. But because we only had Springfield and no one knew just how long Korea would last and what was going to happen, they sought new contractors. And that's where we would end up with Harrington and Richardson, HRA, H&R if you prefer, and International Harvester here. And this is my, of course, Harrington and Richardson. I guess you'd say this is my shooter Garand, such as it goes. And comparing these two, we can see a few minor production changes that crept into the design from 1942 through 1953. To my mind, the rear sight's one of the earliest you see. This is a lock bar. This is actually the second pattern. The first pattern didn't even have this to lock it, so it could just really spin. This would be the first pattern lock bar. There'd be a second pattern. In early 1945, we would go to the style most of us know with kind of the internal ratchet system, which is, frankly, fewer parts, at least on the whole, easier to use, and just more dependable. It really is. Like these early lock bars can literally just unscrew. The pattern after this would be staked in. So they would refine these really fancy sights, peep sights, but fully windage and elevation adjustable. Another change you'll see in 45 is a switch from the machined to a stamped trigger guard. This HRA has the machined guard because, rebuilds and stuff, but it would be a stamped guard. You've seen those in other videos. You know what they look like. The finish could be kind of a dull gray phosphate or almost a blue-looking black shiny phosphate like on this one. Really pretty. That's one reason I have this gun. They would also change the gas plug in the front to make it easier to use and also allow it to use the grenade launcher attachment. And there are a lot of other little changes besides that M1 Garand collectors more knowledgeable than myself know about, like the op rod reshapes a bit. But really the design after all the tinkering of the 1930s, with the big one being the switch of the gas system, stayed pretty much consistent after that. It would take time for H&R and International to tool up, not really turning out their first rifles until 1953, by which time the war was already winding down, and really, I don't believe they saw service actually making it over to Korea, but if they did, it was only at the very tail end. Nevertheless, they had a contract, so they kept making until 1956, although some of their late guns were never even stocked. You could actually find H&Rs that were the complete action, sans wood furniture. They were just put directly into storage. Springfield, for their part, would wrap up production after the war, but they would do one final run, kind of using up spare parts, and they had them, why not, in 1957, because this was the time they were finally getting ready for the new Wunder rifle, the M14. Oh, yes, indeed, the Springfield M14, the rifle that they promised could be built with the same tooling and know-how at little cost from the M1 Garand, and not just replace the Garand, but also the M1 Carbine, M2 Carbine, I'm sure the M3 as well, and all the submachine guns, the Thompson, the grease gun, and even they've said it could replace the 1918 A2, the BAR, the light machine gun of the day and time. And of course it had the wonderful 7.62 NATO cartridge, which was meant to be a do-all cartridge. You know the story. It didn't work. It replaced the Garand, Although it had some issues the Garand did not, overall, I do like that the M14 gave it a box mag. 7.62 NATO is equal to 30-06 in performance, but it's also lighter and more compact, so overall, a better round. Of course, the select fire abilities of the M14 really were not useful, especially in an infantry role, so most of them didn't even have that ability. It was deleted. But as far as replacing the M1 Carbine or M2, very few were successfully replaced by the M14. In certain small roles and situations, okay, but no. And as far as replacing the submachine gun, no, because the submachine gun is meant to be select fire. Again, YouTube, this is a semi-auto only, just, having that out there. But it didn't do that at all. Although, to be fair, the M14 is actually still lighter than the Thompson. And as far as replacing the BAR, pathetic. One benefit to the BAR being so darn heavy, at least it was controllable in automatic fire, even if it only had a 20-round mag. This only had a 20-round mag, and since it's lighter than a lot of the other guns, it was really not controllable unless you were one of the people that could and did train and managed to do it. But those were not your average grunts. I should also point out that the bayonet for the M14 was directly inspired, the M6, by the M4 from the M1 Carbine. Again, kind of continues on. But that was adopted in 1957, started coming into the field in 1959, which led to the M1 Garand being pulled from frontline service by 1965, mostly in European theater. It never really made it to Vietnam in any numbers worth talking about, at least in U.S. hands. And by 1970, it was officially out of frontline service, although some guard units and whatnot might still have them to come. But by that point, the M14 was joining it because, of course, it was very quickly replaced by the M16, rightfully so. But, yeah, I'll stop myself there. No, what they should have done was exactly what Italy did. The Beretta BM59. This is the 59E model. Also, SL looks very similar to this. They took advantage of that Winchester tooling, not to mention tons of guns and parts. In fact, Beretta was one of the authorized repair agencies for the Garand in Europe. This is the most Garand style, of course, detaching mag, same receiver, just modified. They gave it a nice honking muzzle brake, and they gave it a nice thick recoil pad. Even at that, these are mostly used in semi. Here's the stamped trigger guard I was mentioning. And of course, they're firing 7.62 NATO, if I didn't mention that. Did I mention I've been talking for a while? And the thing is, this actually came in on budget and truly reused the parts there. If the U.S. had gone with this, they could have transitioned straight over to the AR-15 when it was available. Saved a lot of money, but we're starting to see the military-industrial complex do its thing that Eisenhower warned us about. Man tried. A good serviceman, a good old-fashioned Republican. Either way, you can see that the guns from World War II had some staying power. Some of them lasting well into the Vietnam period. With that, how about we wrap this up finally? So that's the legacy of the M1 Garand. Not bad at all considering it was a first generation issue self-loading rifle. It would last and influence subsequent designs. The M14 is pretty different, but it was definitely inspired by the Garand. As far as trench guns, while they would not pick up any new Model 97s or Model 12s after World War II, they would still have thousands upon thousands for Korea, and many would still be left over in Vietnam. These are durable guns. They get loose and rattly, but it's a pump shotgun. And Winchester wasn't done with it. After they discontinued the Model 12, they would start selling the U.S. government the Model 1200. And that would be kind of the last one of more Vietnam fame, by which time the Ithaca would have a brief time on the spotlight. The Stevens and the Mossberg and the Remington would be kind of latecomers to the game, and still in service today. In a lot of ways, the 12 gauge hasn't changed. Yeah, they're a little stronger now, definitely could be shorter, quick detaching barrels on a lot of them, but its influence is still felt, and they're still in service, more or less unchanged. Although, of course, the newer ones are 3-inch Magnum versus 2 3/4. The 03 here, I wanted to put it next to the Garand just because the similarities in the rear sight and the grip stock, overall length. The last one to serve, there would be some in Korea, 03 A3s, maybe even some 03s. They used them interchangeably. These are mostly just used by second line grenadiers, stateside. Really, the only one that was still possibly in frontline service would be the 03 A4, the marksman rifle, the sniper rifle, even though the M1 Garand, the M1D, and M1C to some lesser extent were really kind of catching on by that point. But none of those were perfect. We would end up with dedicated sniper rifles like the M40, later M24, and of course modern day examples in different calibers. The M1 Carbine was almost there when it would come to an assault rifle. It wasn't. Almost. The M2, adding select fire, not to mention the T17 and T18 kits that had an M1 select fire, were even closer. Detaching mag, 15-30 rounds. The only thing that really held it back, it wasn't the lack of a pistol grip. That could easily be added, like with the M1A1. It was the cartridge. 30 Carbine, 7.62 by 33. And it wasn't even the size. If it had been a bottleneck Spitzer cartridge, Spitzer bullet, it might have been able to do it. And it was still powerful for a pistol round. This is why there's stolen pistol cartridge counts of 50 instead of 20 for a rifle. It just wasn't quite an intermediate cartridge like 8mm Kurz, which was 7.9 by 33, or of course 7.62 by 39 used by Russia. But it was close. And it hung on even a little bit longer in Vietnam than some of the others. And a lot of these are given to allies, and a lot of them are used for guard duty, police duty in places like West Germany. And of course, the Israelis did a lot with M1 carbines. I should point out that if you see an Ivory Johnson or a Universal, those are commercial guns. And some of them early on, especially Universals, were built with military parts. But if the receiver says Universal or Ivory Johnson, it's not a GI receiver. There's also Federal Ordnance. Google it. As for the Thompson, the Thompson. While the M1 and M1A1 are dedicated U.S. military guns, the Model 21 in 1928 became very famous in the hands of the FBI and other law enforcement, and also infamous in the hands of gangsters, obviously the gun that made the 20s roar. It's a wonder as many went into military service as they did on cost alone, but getting Savage involved and changing it helped a lot. And while the government really wouldn't pick up new ones after the 1940s, one thing you can say about this gun, it is built to last. This gun, even the later versions, is just overbuilt to kingdom come, meaning that many of these were still serviceable in the 60s and 70s. Some police agencies didn't retire theirs to the 90s. But these would be used by the U.S. Armed Forces for decades. And we really wouldn't have another submachine gun for a long time. Not official. Yeah, there was like the Swedish K and some other things, and the Marines would go to the Colt 9mm SMG. But this is one of the last, like, just standard issue. Everyone's got it. Army, Marines, Navy. And it's a piece of Americana right up there with the M1 Garand. And right beside him, of course, is the Browning 1911A1. Again, even though the government actually stopped buying new frames, except for maybe a handful of off-the-shelf purchases later on, they were able to restore and refurbish these, sometimes only using the original World War II frame, everything else being new. but very much the standard issue in Korea, being refurbished like my Remington-Rand, and used in Vietnam, quite famously by the tunnel rats, but just everyone. This was the standard handgun. There were a few high powers that some people had, but this was the standard. And it would keep on keeping on through the 70s and into the 80s, and even after the Beretta came along, some, like the Marines, resisted stubbornly. And it's all really thanks to World War II, where the bulk of production was going. By the way, on the Garand, I didn't mention it, oops. Like I said, about 4.5 million were made during World War II, and then another about 1.5 million were made during Korea. The grand total is a little over 6 million. I've seen 6,200,000, but I think that does include the Beretta produced models as well. But I could be wrong. And then finally, the Victory model. I've always had a soft spot for this one. Revolvers have been in the U.S. military for a very long time. They're not flashy, but they're simple to use, relatively safe, especially with the firing pin safety on this one. They're just convenient. Okay, you only get 6 shots, but for a defensive gun, for a guard, or an air crewman, it's fine. It's not a direct combat thing, but it's fine. And this is really emblematic of the Pacific, the Navy, the Marine Corps. Although, like I said, the Army, Air Corps, Army Air Forces later, and the U.S. Air Force had them. And in fact, instead of mostly going to the 1911, the U.S. Air Force would keep on with the Model 10, the Model 15, and kept refurbishing some old Victory models too. Even having some 2-inchers in Vietnam for like helicopters and planes and what have you. And this would be one of the few that would be purchased from Smith & Wesson Model 10s and Model 15s by the Air Force in the 60s. And they had their own 38 cartridge issued loading. There was even the Air Crewman, which is a really cool story in and of itself. The Model 12, the M13, that whole series. So there's other revolvers besides. But very iconic. And one thing I will say for the U.S. military, unlike a lot of others, this was not a badge of office. These guns were proof tested and put through the ringer to make sure they were fully combat capable. And it showed. U.S. handguns were definitely among the best in World War II. And that's probably why they lasted so very long. So there you have it. Most of the small arms, submachine guns, rifles, and pistols. I don't really do machine guns. The only one I kind of wish I had was a 1918. But I've had the reproductions. They're nice, but they're almost too nice. And they were very spendy and very heavy. And I knew I'd never shoot it. I think if they'd been built with original parts, I would have been tempted, new receiver, maybe new barrel, but original furniture. Oh well, I can't have everything. This is all my personal collection. Guns aren't teeny. They're not given away. I just thought this might be something fun to share while I recover and get well again, and while we get ready for the next range trip. I do have some things planned for that. That should be fun. But let me know your thoughts on World War II American equipment. What do you like? M1 Garand, M1 Carbine? What do you think of the trench gun and the use of a shotgun? What do you think of the submachine gun? Do you like the original Thompson, the M1 style, the grease gun? Maybe you're crazy and like the Reising. I admit it's kind of got some charm. Another rifle that I didn't mention because it was never officially in service, but a few hundred were used ad hoc, the 1941 Johnson. Got to give an honorable mention because, frankly, Melvin Johnson, a Marine, is kind of one of my heroes. His story and the story of his rifle and light machine gun is so very American. And years ago I did a video, and even years before that I did own one, but when the prices went nanners, since it wasn't officially U.S. issue, I decided to let it go. No regrets, such is life. For some reason, I like the Ithaca, even though it's not as in good shape as some of the others out there. It just has a special place, and the same goes for this Victory. I've had it for a long time, probably 20 years. It's a Army Marked I Ordnance Department. The Navy Marked I's, which were also used by the Marines, go for more money, but they're usually in rougher shape, too. And some of the Victories would have, more commercial grips. Even the early ones could even have a high polished finish because they were just off the shelf. But hey, Again, I want to give thanks to the Patreons for helping out, like I mentioned at the top of the video. Sometimes it really does make my day when things are not going good and helps fund range trips like the one we'll have coming up very soon. And we're usually able to make 4 or 6 new videos out of each range trip, and once the cabin project's done, that should get even more efficient. With that, appreciate you tuning in. As always, if you could, like, share, subscribe. Tune in for our live streams. I try to do them about every other Thursday. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time. My voice is dead.